So we're going to go ahead and get started with bones of the skeleton part 2. Like I said, this is going to cover the appendicular skeleton, so we're now moving on from the axial skeleton, covering our appendages. So in part 2, we're going to start again like we did with the axial, going from most superior to inferior. So we're starting with the clavicle bone. And the clavicle is commonly referred to as the collarbone. It helps stabilize the shoulder and provides structural support for the areas for muscle attachment. It is slightly curved, somewhat S-shaped of a bone. The medial end is rounded and it articulates with the sternum. The lateral end is a lot flatter and it'll articulate with the scapula. You've got the coronoid tubercle, which is an area for ligament attachment, and it's located on the lateral end of the posterior-inferior surface. There is a long, shallow depression called the subclavian groove, and that runs along the inferior side of the clavicle's central shaft. So if we look at this again, we're going to look at a image, and you're going to see here the clavicle, and you've got the coronoid tubercle, the subclavian groove, as well as a costal tuberosity. So here it is. Then moving on, we've got the scapula. And on the scapula, we're commonly calling it the shoulder blade. The scapula is large, flat, and a triangular bone. It is fairly mobile. We know that because we can move our arm and our shoulder quite easily. In humans and in some other primates, it is positioned on the posterior surface of the rib cage, right? So on the back. In other primates and animals, the scapula is positioned more to the side of the rib cage, so laterally. So you can think of like a four-legged animal, think a dog. The scapula is going to be more to the sides rather than it is going to be on the back, right? Like it is on us bipeds. Each of the sides or the edges have a name. So if we're going to look at a scapula, you've got the superior border up at top. This runs along the superior end. You've got the vertebral border or the medial border. It runs along the medial edge parallel to the vertebral column. And then you have the axillary border, which is on this side. You can see this on here on the other side. The axillary border runs along the lateral edge near the armpit, right? So superior on top, vertebral on the medial, and then axillary along the armpit. So if we're looking at this and we're saying this is the top, this is the side facing the vertebra, and this is the axillary side facing the armpit, this would be a right scapula, right? And then this is the same scapula on a posterior view, right? And so you can see here the superior border, the axillary or lateral border, and then you've got the vertebral medial border. On the posterior surface of the scapula, there is a ridge of bone that runs roughly parallel to the superior border. It's called the scapular spine. You can see it up here. And then at the lateral edge of the spine, there's a projection called the acromion process. This articulates with our clavicle. Near the acromion process along the superior border, there's another large projection called the coronoid process. The coracoid process, right up here. The coracoid process is an area for arm muscle attachment. Where the axillary and the superior borders meet, there is a round depression called the glenoid fossa. You can see it here on this image. The glenoid fossa articulates with the head of the humerus and it forms the highly mobile shoulder joint. So again, fossas again are depressions. Usually you've got a joint there, and so here's where the humerus would attach to. So here we go. Here is an anterior view. Then you've got a posterior view, right, of the scapula. Now we're going to move on to the humerus. The humerus is the upper arm bone. It's typically a long bone, or it is a typical long bone. The proximal end is called the head. It has a rounded shape. It's part of the humerus that articulates the glenoid fossa. Let me get a picture here for you. Here's the head. It articulates the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Near the head, there are two important projections, the lesser tubercle and the greater tubercle. So the lesser tubercle is the more anterior. So here's the lesser tubercle. It is the more anterior of the two and the smaller of the two. The greater tubercle is more posterior and it is larger. Both of these tubercles are for muscle attachment. Between the two tubercles, there is an indentation called the intertubercular or bicipital groove. Right? You can see it here. It's between the two. This groove accommodates a tendon of the biceps muscle. So below the head, then, there is an area called the surgical neck. You can see it here in this image. This joins the head of the humerus to the shaft of the humerus. Further down the shaft, on the lateral surface, there's an area called the deltoid tuberosity. Right here. This is where the deltoid muscle attaches. At the distal end of the humerus, there are several key features. You've got the capitulum, and the capitulum is a rounded projection on the lateral side, and it articulates with the radius, or the lower arm bone. So here is the capitulum. The trochlea is an area that is shaped like a spool of thread, right? So here's the trochlea. It is shaped like a spool of thread and it is medial to the capitulum and it articulates with the ulna, the other lower arm bone. So here the radius will articulate and then here the ulna will articulate. The lateral and slightly proximal to the capitulum is a projection called the lateral epicondyle, right? So up here. And the lateral epicondyle is on this side. Sorry, the medial epicondyle on the other side is slightly larger, and it is positioned slightly proximal to the trochlea, so a little bit closer. Both epicondyles, the lateral and the medial epicondyle, are areas for ligament and or muscle attachment for the lower arm. The distal end of the humerus has two pronounced depressions. The olecranon fossa, right here, is a larger depression on the posterior surface, and then the coronoid fossa on this side is a smaller depression on the anterior surface. Both of these depressions articulate with the ulna as part of the elbow joint. So here again, we're looking at the images. You've got an anterior view, a posterior view, and here a close-up of the proximal end of the human left humerus. You can see the important features here distinguished of the bone, like the lesser tubercle, the greater tubercle, and then the intertubercular groove. Right, so this is the part that articulates with the scapula to create the shoulder joint. So moving now more distally, right, or moving more inferiorly, we have the radius and the ulna. And so the lower arm is made up of these two long bones, the radius and the ulna. The proximal ends of both the radius and the ulna articulate with the humerus. Right, so I'm going to go to some pictures, right? So the proximal end, again, of both the radius and the ulna articulate with the humerus. The distal ends articulate with the carpals and they form the wrist. So with your arm at your side and your hand facing forward, the radius will be more lateral and shorter of the two lower arm bones. Right, so if you put your hand out and you try that out again, the radius is the more lateral, so farther away, and it is the shorter of the two lower arm bones. Its proximal end of the radius has a round depression called the head, which articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. Below the head, there is a projection on the anteromedial surface called the radial tuberosity. This is an attachment for your biceps muscle, right? So here's your radial tuberosity, right below the head. And this is where your bicep muscle attaches to. Between the head and the radial tuberosity, the bone is constricted and narrower in an area called the neck of the radius, right? So here it is, the neck, right between the radial tuberosity and the head. The shaft of the radius extends from the neck to the distal end of the bone. At the distal end, there is a sharply pointed area called the styloid process, right? It's right here. You can see it here also. It's quite sharp. And this is on the lateral end of the bone. So with your arm at your side and the palm of your hand facing forward now, we're going to move on to the ulna, right? So we said the radius, when you have your arm at your side and your palm facing forward, it is the more lateral and smaller of the bones. Now the ulna is the more medial and the longer of the two arm bones, right? So arm at your side, palm facing outward. The more medial side, the more medial bone, the one closer to your midline, is the ulna. So the ulna has a unique wrench-shaped proximal end formed by several key features. So the olecranon process is a large projection that accommodates muscle attachment, and it fits in the olecranon fossa of the humerus when the arm is extended. This is the large bony area that we normally think of as the tip of our elbow. Just below the olecranon fossa, there is an area called the trochlear notch, right? So here we've got the olecranon process, right, what we normally think of as our elbow. Right here you've got your trochlear notch. So this is a C-shaped notch that articulates with the rounded trochlea of the humerus. Remember the spool of thread kind of shaped thing on our humerus. At the base of the trochlear notch on the anterior surface, there's a pointy projection called the coronoid process that articulates with the coronoid fossa of the humerus, right here. The ulna articulates with the radius at the radial notch. So right here, there's another notch, and it'll articulate with the radius. This is located on the lateral end of the coronoid process. The main length of the ulna is called the shaft, right? So we're all the way down here. And the distal end is marked by a pointy projection that we call the styloid process. However, in the ulna, the styloid process is located on the medial side of the bone rather than on the lateral side. So if you remember here on the radius, it's located on the medial side, on the lateral side, sorry. And then on the ulna is located on the medial side, right? So you have a styloid process on both. So that gives us our radius and our ulna. Next, we're going to move on to the wrist and the hand, right? So the bones of the wrist and hand, they take three basic forms. Our carpals, our metacarpals, and our hand phalanges, right? So our carpals are known as our wrist bones. Our metacarpals is where our palm is at, so our palm or hand bones, and then our phalanges are our finger bones. There are 8 carpals in each hand. They are typically short bones, and they appear generally cube-like in shape. They provide wrist support, and they limit the mobility in our wrist area. So we're going to go to a picture here so you can see them there. They're positioned in 2 rows with 4 bones in each row. The proximal row from lateral to medial is the scaphoid. Right here is the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetral, right here, or the triquetrum, and the pisiform, right? So here you go again, the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetrum, and the pisiform. The distal row, again from lateral to medial, include the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. So all of these bones generally have a cube shape, but they do vary in the exact shape and size. So again, you've got the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetral or the triquetrum, the pisiform. You've got then the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. So the bones of the hand and the palm then, right here, these 5, they are called the metacarpals. There are 5 metacarpals in each hand with 1 metacarpal corresponding to each finger. And they are numbered from 1 to 5, with 1 corresponding to the thumb and 5 corresponding to this finger. So metacarpal 1, metacarpal 2, metacarpal 3, metacarpal 4, and metacarpal 5. The proximal end, so this end closer to the trunk of the body, the proximal end is somewhat square-shaped and concave, and it articulates with 1 or more rounded carpal surfaces. In humans, the proximal end of the metacarpals 2 through 5 also articulate with adjacent metacarpals, right? So 2 through 5, and you can see that they are articulating with the adjacent metacarpals. The distal end of the metacarpal is more rounded. So up here, the distal end. And it articulates with a phalanx or a finger bone. The finger bones, or the phalanges for plural, phalanx for singular, that is what these are called, right? Our finger bones, phalanges, phalanx. The thumb has only 2 phalanges, but all the other 4 fingers have 3 phalanges. So from the metacarpal to the fingertip, the 3 phalanges of each finger are referred to as the proximal phalange, the intermediate phalange, and the distal phalanx, right? So proximal phalanx, intermediate phalanx, and distal phalanx. The thumb, however, only has a proximal and a distal phalanx. In general, the hand phalanges get smaller as they approach the fingertips. You can see how they start off quite large and then they get smaller as they approach the fingertips. And then the proximal phalanges, they are they're the largest, and the distal ones being the smallest. The distal phalanges have a flattened distal end. So as we go out the very tip, it flattens out. And this corresponds to the pads on our fingertips. So here again, we've got the bones of the hand. We have our carpal tunnels, right? And we've got our scaphoid again, our lunate, our triquetral, our pisiform, our trapezium, our trapezoid, capitate, and hamate, right? Those are the carpal bones. Here you can see the carpal bones disarticulated. Again, hamate, capitate, trapezoid, trapezium, scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform. Right. So again, this is going from lateral to medial if you go this way, and again from proximal to distal. So if you're looking at it here, it is scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, and then trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Same order: scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Right. You can see our capitate here, it is quite large. Our hamate is next to it, and our pisiform sometimes on our models is just merged in with our triquetral. So here you can see a metacarpal, right? It's an anterior view of a typical left metacarpal bone. There's a difference you can see between the proximal and the distal end. And then here we have a phalange, right? A full finger bone. So you've got, it's an anterior view from one of the left fingers. 4 fingers each have 3 phalanges, and those that you can see here with our proximal phalanx, our intermediate phalanx, and our distal phalanx. So now we've completed from the clavicle to the scapula to the humerus, the radius ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So we've completed the upper half of the body. So now we're going to move on to the pelvis. And the pelvis, or the pelvic girdle, appears to be one large bone, but it is actually composed of 3 separate bones. The posterior is formed by the sacrum, which we covered in the axial skeleton. The sides and anterior are formed by two ossicoxae, or os coxa when you're talking about a single one. They are also called innominate bones or hip bones. The ossicoxa articulate with the sacrum posteriorly at the sacroiliac joint, and they articulate to each other anteriorly at the pubic symphysis joint. Each os coxae is in turn then formed by the fusion of three bones: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So the ilium is a large blade-like area that you can feel when you put your hands on your hips, right? It is that side that you can grab onto. It's that ilium side. The ischium forms the underside upon which we sit upon. So where you're sitting right now, you're sitting on your ischium. And then the pubis is the anterior region, and it is the area where the two ossicoxae articulate with one another. So if we look at a picture here, you can see here you've got your ilium, right? Your pubis, and then let's see, it's kind of back here. You can't really see your ischium, but they're back here. Let's see, there's more. There you go. So ischium, right? Your pubis, and then your ilium. Let's go back. All right. So the pelvis is an important area for muscle attachment, such as for your gluteus muscles, and so those help us move the leg and stabilize the body during locomotion. The other thing that the pelvis is really useful for is for determining an individual's sex, because this varies considerably between males and females. And when we get to human variation, and we're going to talk about this a lot more, and also when we talk, actually the next chapter when we talk about forensics and bioarchaeology. We're going to talk about this more because we're going to learn how to determine sex based on the pelvis. So looking at the pelvis, you have three parts again: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And so the ilium, on the medial surface of the ilium, there's an ear-shaped area called the auricular surface. Let me go here. Do you see the auricular? Yeah. So the auricular surface. This is where our os coxa articulates with the sacrum, and it forms the sacroiliac joint. The superior edge of the ilium is called the iliac crest. So you can see it better in this picture, iliac crest. This is an attachment area for numerous abdominal muscles. The anterior superior iliac spine, which we see right here, is found at the anterior end of the iliac crest. And the posterior superior iliac spine, right here, is found at the posterior end of the iliac crest. Both the anterior superior iliac spine and the posterior posterior superior iliac spine are areas for muscle attachment. Next on the ilium, let's go back here. So you've got the greater sciatic notch, and this is located inferior to the posterior superior iliac spine. I feel like it's better if I show you a picture, right? So inferior to the posterior superior iliac spine, so the back upper iliac spine, right? It is inferior to that. So our greater sciatic notch here. It accommodates muscles and nerves that run through the pelvis to the lower limb. The acetabulum, which you can see on this side, is a large cup-like depression on the lateral surface of the os coxa, and it is located anterior and slightly inferior to the greater sciatic notch, and it is the area of the pelvis that articulates the femur head to form the hip joint. So right here. It is also where the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis fuse together. So remember I said it's three bones that fuse together. This is where they fuse together. Next, you've got the ischium. So posterior to the acetabulum and inferior to the greater sciatic notch, you'll find the ischial spine. So right over here, the ischial spine. The lesser sciatic notch then is located just inferior to that ischial spine. So right here. So you've got the greater sciatic notch and you've got a lesser sciatic notch, right? This accommodates an important leg muscle. Then after that, the large rough area of bone just below the lesser sciatic notch is called the ischial tuberosity. And I don't think you can see it very well here. Right here. So the ischial tuberosity. This, it forms the posterior-inferior corner of the pelvis, and it is an attachment point for several leg muscles. And lastly is the pubis. So the superior pubic ramus, so if we go back right here, superior pubic ramus joins the pubis to the ilium in the acetabulum. And the inferior pubic ramus joins the pubis to the ischium. Together with the ischium, these two rami form a large hole called the obturator foramen, right? So you can see it here, the obturator foramen. This allows for the passage of nerves and blood vessels between the pelvis and the leg. Then you've got the pubic symphysis. So if we look here, the pubic symphysis is the relatively immobile cartilaginous joint where the pubis bones and the two ossicocci articulate. So the pubic symphysis right here. The surface of the pubis that is involved in this articulation is called the pubic symphysial face. And this is an important area to estimate the age of a skeleton, which we'll get to in the next chapter. All right, so let me see if I can show you. Here you go, the pubic symphysial face, right? So moving on from the pelvis is the femur and the patella. So the large and heavy thigh bone, we know it as the femur. The proximal end, let me show you pictures. The proximal end of the femur has a round head that articulates with the acetabulum of the pelvis, right here. The head of the femur then has a small depression in the center called the fovea capitis, right here, the fovea capitis. Inside this fovea capitis, an important ligament will run between here and the acetabulum, and this will help keep the femur in place in the hip joint. Below the head, there is a constricted area called the neck of the femur, and this joins the head and the shaft. Right, so here is the neck. On the lateral side of the proximal end of the femur, there is a large projection called the greater trochanter. Right, so right here, you can see it better here. The greater trochanter, is a muscle attachment site for the gluteal muscles that originate on the pelvis. Just below where the femur neck meets the shaft on the posterior surface, there is an area of attachment for muscles from the pelvis and the lower back. Between the greater and lesser trochanters on the posterior surface of the femur, there is a ridge called the enterochanteric crest, right here. Between the trochanters on the anterior surface, there's a less pronounced line in the bone called the enterochanteric line. Extending down the femur shaft from the greater trochanter, there is an area called the gluteal tuberosity, right here, on the posterior lateral surface. This can be a pronounced projection, or it can appear as simply as a rough area of the bone. It depends on your muscle attachment again, right? So because this is the area for gluteal muscle attachment. So again, the more you use your gluteal muscle, the larger it'll be, and then the larger this gluteal tuberosity needs to be. Beginning at the inferior end of the gluteal tuberosity and extending down much of the posterior shaft surface, there is a ridge of bone called the linea aspera. You can see that here, the linea aspera. That is an important area for the attachment of our hamstring muscles. So there are two large rounded projections at the distal end of the femur. The more medial projection is called the medial condyle, so you can see that here, and the more lateral is called the lateral condyle. These two condyles will articulate with the proximal end of the tibia or the shin bone, and it'll form the knee joint. On the posterior surface between these two condyles, there's a depression called the intercondylar notch, so inter in between the two condyles, intercondylar notch, and also called the intercondylar fossa. On the anterior surface between the condyles, there's a depression called the patellar surface. So right here between the two condyles, again, is the patellar surface. This is where the patella or the kneecap will articulate, and it will move back and forth during knee movement. The patella, also known as the kneecap, here we go, is a small bone, somewhat triangular in shape. So the patella is the largest sesamoid bone in the body. So what is sesamoid bone? It is a bone that is embedded within a tendon. And they are usually very tiny, but this is the largest out of all of them. The patella articulates with the patellar surface on the anterior side of the distal femur. Here's another look closely at just the patella. It moves up and down along the surface as the knee moves, helping both protect the knee and facilitating its function. And it has three key features. The distal tip of the patella comes to a slight point called the apex, right? So distal meaning farther away from the trunk. On the posterior surface, the patella has two depressions that articulate with the distal surface of the femur. The medial depression is called the medial articular facet, and the lateral depression is called the lateral articular facet. So we've finished the femur and the patella. We're going to move on to the tibia and the fibula. So the lower leg is comprised of two long bones, the tibia and the fibula. I'm going to take you to a picture while I discuss these. The tibia is commonly called the shin bone. It is the thicker of the two, and it is more medial of the two leg bones. So if you're standing in anatomical position, you're gonna feel your shin bone, right? It's more medial. More laterally is your fibula. So the tibia, again, commonly called the shin bone. The proximal end of the tibia is marked by a relatively flat surface called the tibial plateau. This articulates with the distal end of the femur. So here up here is the tibial plateau. The medial side of the tibial plateau is formed by the medial condyle. Right, so you can see this here, the medial condyle. And the lateral side of the tibial plateau is formed by the lateral condyle. These condyles are separated by a small raised area called the intercondylar eminence. Right, so up here on top, it's an intercondylar eminence. Toward the posterior of the lateral condyle, there is a small facet called the superior fibular articular facet. This is where the proximal ends of the tibia and the fibula articulate, right? So right here, it's this depression, right? And this is where the tibia and the fibula will articulate. Interior to the tibial plateau on the anterior surface, there is a projection called the tibial tuberosity, and that is an area of attachment for the quadriceps muscle, right over here. Along the anterior surface of the central tibia shaft, there is a sharp crest of bone called the anterior crest, right here, and it is the area of bone you can feel when you run your fingers down your shin. At the distal end of the tibia, there is a projection on the medial side of the bone called the medial malleolus. This is what you feel when we feel on the inside of our ankle, right? It's a large knob of bone we feel on the inside of our ankle. On the lateral side of the tibia, there is an inferior fibular articular surface or a fibular notch. This is where the distal ends of the tibia and the fibula articulate, right? So right down here. The fibula now is the thinner and the more lateral of the two leg bones. Unlike the tibia, the fibula is not involved in the knee joint, right? So it doesn't connect. At the proximal end, the fibula has a rounded head that articulates with the tibia. So right up here. The shaft of the fibula is long and thin, and then the distal end of the fibula is somewhat flatter than the rounded head, and it is marked by a projection at the tip of the bone called the lateral malleolus. So remember we had our medial malleolus on the tibia that we feel on the inside of our ankle. Now the lateral malleolus is the projection and the knob of bone that we can feel on the outside of our ankle. So medial malleolus goes on our tibia, lateral malleolus on our fibula. So moving on from there is the ankle and the foot. Similar to our wrist and the hand, the bones of the ankle and the foot take three basic forms. Tarsals, our ankle bones, metatarsals, our foot bones, and our phalanges, or our toe bones. And so I'm going to take you to a picture. There are 7 tarsals in each foot, and like the carpals, they are generally cube-like in their shape, generally. Tarsals are larger than the carpals, and they are not positioned in 2 rows. We can separate them out by looking at our 2 largest. The first one is the calcaneus. This forms the heel of the foot. The second largest tarsal is the talus. It is medial and superior to the calcaneus, and it articulates with the tibia and the fibula to form the ankle. The third largest tarsal is the cuboid, which is right here. It lies between the calcaneus and the metatarsals, and it is mostly regularly a cube-shaped tarsal. After that, you've got the navicular. The navicular is positioned medial to the cuboid between the talus and the remaining tarsals. The last 3 are the cuneiforms, right? There are 3 cuneiforms listed from most medial to most lateral. So you have our medial cuneiform, our intermediate cuneiform, and our lateral cuneiform. So the tarsal bones are actually quite easy to memorize. Our calcaneus, our talus, our cuboid, our navicular. Right, so these are quite easy to memorize, and then you've got your cuneiforms. So again, calcaneus, talus, cuboid, navicular, medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiforms. So while most of these bones have a general cube shape, they vary considerably in their exact shape and their size. The calcaneus and talus have a particularly unusual shape. And then the bones of the foot, so we can see that with our tarsals. Then we get to the bones of our foot, and these are our metatarsals. So like our hand, we have carpals, metacarpals. Here we have tarsals and metatarsals. The foot is laid out similarly to the hand. Right, there are 5 metatarsals in each foot, with 1 metatarsal corresponding to each toe. The metatarsals are numbered again 1 through 5, just like we had with our metacarpals, with 1 corresponding to the big toe, which is called the hallux, and 5 corresponding to the pinky toe. The proximal end of the metatarsal is somewhat square-shaped and concave, and it articulates with the complementary tarsal surface. At the distal end of the metatarsal is a more rounded end, and it articulates with the phalanx. Again, like our finger bones, the toe bones are also called toe phalanges or phalanx singular. Layout again is similar to our finger bones, and the hallux, which is the only one that has its own separate name, has only 2 phalanges, but the other toes have 3. Again, similar to our hand phalanges. From the metatarsals to the ends of the toes, the 3 phalanges of each toe are referred to as, again, the proximal, the intermediate, and the distal phalanx. All right, so here again is the tarsals. They are disarticulated. You can see the differences here a little bit better when you're looking at them disarticulated. Right, again, calcaneus, talus, navicular, cuboid, and then medial, intermediate, lateral, cuneiform. Here you've got the metatarsal. Again, it's an anterior view of a typical human left metatarsal. You can see the difference here between the proximal and the distal end, right? Squarer, more flat, and a rounded distal end. And here are the three phalanges. Proximal phalanx, intermediate phalanx, and distal phalanx. And that is the end of the appendicular skeleton and the end of the crash course to the skeleton.